This is our final presentation on qualitative research methods. We've talked about the basics of qualitative research. We've examined the primary mode of research design in qualitative research, the ethnography. Now I want to talk about some of the other qualitative designs that are utilized. They really are all kind of an offshoot of ethnography. They use similar methods and so on. However, typically we see a little bit different focus on how the data is collected or who it's collected on. So let's take a look at the qualitative designs that we'll be discussing in this unit. So the objectives for this presentation include looking at the different types of designs beyond ethnography. First, we'll take a look at these designs, and they include case studies, phenomenological studies, and text analysis, and how these different techniques all kind of adapt or modify the techniques that we talked about when we examined ethnography. I want you to understand the bounded nature of case studies and what that means. That case studies are basically going to be focused on a particular subgroup or group within another group, and therefore it's much more focused than we typically see in an ethnography that's looking at a broader group of individuals or an entire culture. I also want you to understand phenomenological studies and the methods of data collection, analysis, and interpretation that are utilized in these types of studies. We also want to look at narrative studies from the same viewpoint, examining how the data is collected, how it's analyzed, and how it's written up, because it is somewhat different than the other styles that we've talked about. And then finally, we'll take a look at text analysis. It isn't used very frequently in our field, but it allows for an examination of written documents, which can include emails, texts, tweets, about a particular topic or event or by a particular person. And then the researchers use that information as their data that they collect and use information from it to gain more understanding, greater understanding or greater depth of understanding of a particular event or a group. In our previous presentation, we discussed ethnography, which really is kind of the root methodology in qualitative research. And the types of other methods are really still derived from or modifications of ethnography. So there are many different types of modifications of ethnography that are utilizing the qualitative realm, but I want to talk about four in particular here that we do see utilized in our field. They are all our adaptations of ethnography. And they've adapted the practices, again, of participant observation, field notes, and utilizing various lenses through which to view the data. So for this presentation, I want to consider case studies as a design, phenomenological studies, narrative studies, and text analysis. And we're going to take a look at each of these individually and talk about some of the research from our field that I've found that I'll be sharing with you in these different subtypes of other qualitative research methods. Case studies are probably the most common type of qualitative method used after ethnographies. And really, case studies are very, very similar to ethnographies in that they attempt to describe and interpret a phenomenon or an event that occurs with a person or within a small group. So that's the big difference is as opposed to ethnographies where they're attempting to describe kind of a culture or a much larger group, case studies occur within a bounded context. So that may or may not mean that we can apply what we have found to the general population. So typically it's an in-depth view of individuals or actors that have gone through a specific type of a program. They're parts of a specific team. They've undergone a specific event or been present for a specific phenomenon. So unlike ethnographies where we're looking at much broader groups, these are much more focused groups, and that's why they call them within a bounded context. Case studies rely on interviews and observations and participant observation with key actors and so on. There often is quantitative data that's used to identify the appropriate cases for the study. So maybe we've identified that we are only going to be including people in our study that can lift a certain amount of weight, that can run a certain speed, that participate in some specific training program, and so on. So often there's some type of quantitative data or categorical data that allows us to decide who's appropriate for the study, to be actors within this study. Typically, case studies, because they're much more focused, they often require less research time for the researcher because we're looking at a smaller group or looking at a group during a particular event. Some examples that I've found and have placed in our reading, the first is called A Qualitative Perspective on How Manchester United Football Club Developed and Sustained Serial Winning. This study, obviously, if you're familiar with soccer, that's what they call it in the rest of the world, football. Manchester United is one of the most successful professional soccer teams, or really any professional team in the world. And they have a very developed youth program. They have a very set way to try to enhance their performance of their players. And that's what's studied in this example. It's a case study because it's doing a cultural study. So it's an ethnography, but it really is looking just within the Manchester United Football Club. So that's the bounded context here. The second study I have listed in this area is a qualitative investigation of sport activity participation and constraint negotiation among African American endurance runners. Also, a bounded context here. And that allows us to study these individuals that are engaged in an endurance program. It also uses a critical theory approach because it's attempting to look at race and how that affects participation or non-participation within this group. Phenomenological studies are centered around a specific experience. So they investigate human experiences, often called lived experiences in qualitative research, and the meanings these experiences hold for the actors. So it searches for the essence of the experience from the actor's perspective, attempts to gain an insider's perspective. Remember, we talked about insider versus outsider perspective. Here, what we're most focused on is how did this individual or a group of individuals experience this event? What emotions did they feel? What happened? What occurred? What were the other things going on at the time that helped them succeed, or whatever it may be? It uses bracketing. The researcher, to really do this type of study, has to separate his or her own worldview from that of the actors. So we have to, again, leave our preconceived notions at the door as the researcher and try to understand how this person experienced this phenomenon. Again, really interesting because it gives us a unique insight on other cultures, other individuals, and again, how they think about different types of events. It typically utilizes open-ended interviews with a small number of actors, and then phenomenological reduction, which we talked about in our first presentation on qualitative research, is used for the analysis, which again falls along that continuum from insider to outsider. It falls closest to the insider. So we're really trying to get their opinions, their beliefs, and so on. The research technique typically utilizes transcription of interviews. They use a lengthy review process of those interviews to formulate themes and so on within the data. I have a couple examples that I'm sharing with you. The first one, some of you have mentioned an interest in this area, is called Perceptions of Rehabilitation and Return to Sport Among High School Athletes with Anterior Cruciate Ligament Reconstruction, a qualitative research study. And what this does is it attempts to explain what these individuals are thinking when they're returning to sport following a very significant reconstruction of their knee and a fairly long and arduous rehabilitation process. Again, trying to understand what their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions are as they complete their rehab program and then return to participation, which can be very useful to us that are working with athletes in this particular realm, because we need to know what are their fears, what are their worries, how can we allay some of those fears and worries. Another example that I have is exploring experiences of running an ultra marathon. And this study really neat if you're interested in endurance activities, endurance participation, because they interviewed these individuals before, after, and even during an ultra marathon to examine some of the reasons maybe they considered stopping the race, quitting the race, and so on. Again, really kind of a fascinating way to explore this phenomenon of completing an ultra marathon. Narrative studies are another type of research design in qualitative research. Narrative studies tell stories. That's really what they are. They describe and give meaning to lived experiences of individuals through storytelling. Often they involve just one individual or maybe a small group of individuals, and it brings order to the events and to the events that they went through and coherence to the complexity of the experience. So we get to really see what it was like for that individual to train for this event, complete the event, and then what it's like after the fact. Like how did they feel and so on. That's just one example. They're similar to phenomenological studies. However, they're more linear and more story-like. And what it does is it attempts to bring a coherent and well-ordered story that provides insights to others that can benefit us from learning about how this one person maybe approached this event. Often they're written from the perspective of the actor as the narrator, and the researcher is kind of a secondary person. So again, the data is collected by the researcher through interviews and so on, where the actual actor tells the story. The story, the telling, the interviews and so on are transcribed. It's analyzed by the researcher and then written by the researcher. Often it's reviewed by the actor to make sure that he or she feels that it's an accurate representation of what happened, what they were thinking, what they were feeling, and so on, and then rewritten based upon that feedback. So it really is a narrative. And again, these can be very fascinating because you get to see, I'm kind of a history buff, you kind of get to see what that person was thinking as they went through the event. So sometimes the event itself is fascinating, but then to hear the person's individual insights and thoughts as they approached the event is even more fascinating. Just adds another layer of interest. I have a couple examples in our literature for this unit. One is called "Learning to Run from Narrative Foreclosure: One Woman's Story of Aging and Physical Activity." And it sort of trails one woman through her process of becoming more physically active and engaging in running. A second one is called "From a Fall in the Mall to a Run in the Sun," and one journey to an Ironman triathlon. And it again follows an individual that got hurt walking in the mall and then completed an Ironman triathlon and goes through that process of from falling and deciding that I needed to improve performance to the extent of being able to complete in Ironman. So again, really kind of uplifting stories that we can learn from and potentially share some of that information with others that we may work with. Again, often these can be fascinating studies. Text analyses are where the researcher reads and examines texts of some type. So there really are two forms of text analysis that exist in the qualitative research: a qualitative document analysis and a critical discourse analysis. Sort of have talked about these before, but a qualitative document analysis describes and interprets written materials produced by the actors. And these are unsolicited materials. So these could be emails, these could be books written, documents written, texts, tweets, and so on, that are unsolicited by the researcher, but that the researcher then reads, and from the content of these different communications kind of builds a story and a better understanding of the actors, what they were thinking, and so on. It often requires, again, sorting, grouping, eliminating different documents that may or may not have relevance to the actual event or to the actors. Critical discourse analysis applies critical theories to text and speech. Again, so applies these frameworks of power relationships and so on, societal influences, to the texts as well. So it adds another frame of reference to these texts that are being evaluated. Both of these are used infrequently in our field. They're used much more frequently in historical research and so on, but there are some examples of this. I found one that was completed fairly recently. It's called Athletes as Advocates: Influencing Eating Disorder Beliefs and Perceptions Through Social Media. And it examined how a couple athletes that have self-identified as having an eating disorder, and their tweets and then the response tweets helped shape belief and perceptions of others about eating disorders as a condition. So again, just another way, kind of interesting way to use social media to perform some research. The references, all of the articles that I've discussed are referenced here if you want to find them. I will share them in our course homepage as well, or links to them for you to read. Again, you do not have to read them all. The first one is a textbook that I've used used for this presentation. The others, however, again, you don't have to read them all, but I would encourage you to go through, read some of the, if not all, of the abstracts. And then I'm sure there are a couple studies that are of probably greater interest to you. Go ahead and read the whole thing there and pay attention to not only the study and their findings, but also their methodology that are utilized.